Hello, and thanks for joining us for this program of the Learning Center here at Senior Citizens Incorporated. I'm Roger Smith, Director of the Learning Center, and it's my pleasure to be starting our 6-week series called After the War, the lives and careers of people who led both the United States and the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And it's a pleasure today to begin the series with a conversation about just what the nation was thinking about once 1865 had come and gone. We are joined today by Dr. Stan Deaton, who is the senior historian at the Georgia Historical Society, where he has served for 26 years. And in fact, he is my former colleague, and it feels wonderful to sit down knee to knee and elbow to elbow with Stan one more time for the conversations about American history that he and I used to have on a very regular basis. So Stan, thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure to be here with you.
Isn't it fun?
Yes.
I think this is going to be a really interesting hour together. So in the next 5 weeks, we're going to be looking one figure at a time at Civil War leadership, both United States leadership, Confederate leadership, and asking ourselves through this series of lectures, what exactly it took in this nation for people to have a career, a life, achievements and so on after the war was over. So I want to start off this conversation by reminding our audience that only a handful of people from the former Confederacy underwent any kind of retribution, criminal or otherwise, for their role in the war. So a kind of infamous figure, Henry Wirz, and someone he knew and worked with, Champ Ferguson, were both executed for crimes that they committed against prisoners of war here in Georgia. The president of the former Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was captured and spent 2 years in prison, but he was never charged with treason. So how can we account for being able to list in less than 60 seconds the people who engaged in insurrection against the United States? Is that something about getting off easy? How do you characterize that?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great setup, and I think it's important for us to remember to pull back just a little bit to the beginning of April 1865. We live in very tumultuous times now. We feel like things are coming at us 100 miles an hour every day. It's hard to keep up with sometimes the bad and the good news all at the same time. So imagine in April 1865, the war ends virtually with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox on a Sunday, and the following Friday evening, President Lincoln is assassinated, and he dies on Saturday, on a Good Friday yet. So there is enormous range of emotions across the nation, and including the Confederacy. There was a sense, even in the Confederacy, that Abraham Lincoln was going to take a much more lenient view of how to do Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was the political act. It is not, I often had to remind students, it is not the literal rebuilding of the South, but a political reconstruction. Lincoln's plan of Reconstruction had already been submitted in 1864 to Congress and had been rejected as being too lenient. He simply wanted to get on with the process of reunification as easily as possible. His assassination changed everything. Of course, there was a sense of vengeance that here at the very moment of success of reuniting the nation, or at least putting down this rebellion or insurrection, that the leader had been struck down. And so there was enormous cry for vengeance. And I think it's also important to remember of those two people, the Lincoln conspirators, of course, were also put to death, up to and including the woman who owned the boarding house, Mrs. Surratt. So there was a hope on some side, in some hearts, and a belief certainly among many that Jefferson Davis was implicit in this assassination. And so when he was captured on May 10th in Irwinville here in Georgia, he was taken to Fortress Monroe in Virginia, and he was held there for 2 years, as you say. He actually was charged with treason. It actually went to court, but they ended up dropping the charges. So immediately there's this question of what to do. What to do? Americans have been fighting Americans, as you said. Are we going to line everybody up against a wall and shoot them? Well, Ulysses S. Grant has sort of answered that question a little bit, because on that preceding Sunday, April 9th, he had gotten General Lee to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, and he basically paroled everybody. He said, if you go home and behave yourselves and abide by the laws where you live, you will not be molested further. Now, of course, that really only applied to people below a certain rank, usually colonel. The officers, it was still up in the air as to what might happen to them. But Lee went about his business in the hopes that he would be left alone. When Congress, now, Davis did not like the fact that Lee had surrendered without his authority or permission. Lincoln was, of course, thrilled that Grant had been able to do this. Sherman took Johnston's surrender in North Carolina not very many weeks later. So the war was really winding down, and the question was, are we really just going to let all of these people go home who've waged war against the United States? Now, many of those people had never taken an oath to defend the Constitution the way the leaders had, like Davis and Lee particularly. And in fact, when Congress passed legislation that sort of disallowed citizenship for certain levels of Confederate leaders, they even put a special provision in for people who had graduated from the U.S. Military Academy and the U.S. Naval Academy, both of which Davis and Lee had done. They were West Point graduates. So there's tremendous tension between people like Lincoln and then others after his death that we should, as Lincoln said, to use his words, let them up easy. The main goal is reconciliation and reunion. Nobody will be it will never be a benefit to the nation for us to be vindictive. Plenty of other people, families in states who had sacrificed multiple children, the fact that they'd seen these white Southern leaders had brought on this conflict, which had caused, there's a sense of vindictiveness of at least there needs to be some retribution. They need to be stripped of political rights, and there need to be maybe some selective hangings. People need to be charged with treason and put to death. Chief among them, Jefferson Davis. When they discovered he wasn't in any way involved in the Lincoln assassination, it then sort of fell to, well, can we make the charge of treason stick? Long story short, they really didn't know if they could, because there were many people, good legal minds, who said, it's not clear in the U.S. Constitution as it's written that secession in 1861 wasn't legal. We just simply don't know. Do you really want to risk the political theater of putting somebody like Davis on trial and have him be found not guilty of treason? Then where are we? And what does that say to the future? So in 1867, they dropped all the charges and they let him go. So that was the end of it, really, by 1867. Now, it's not the end of what's going to happen to the former Confederates. It is unprecedented that something as big and as violent and as deadly as the U.S. Civil War, normally in history, anything like that there had been enormous retribution. The Russian Civil War that happened in 1917 through 1921 or later, there are still being volumes written about that, and it's difficult to even read because it was so violent, it was so bad, the hatred and the retribution from one side to the other. So the U.S. Civil War was almost unique. At the end of the day, there were people who lost the right to vote for a little while. Some people had to apply personally to Andrew Johnson, and he liked that. Being Southern, he'd always hated the planter class. He wanted people to apply to him directly to have their citizenship renewed. Robert E. Lee was one of them who tried to do that. Davis refused to do it. Even after 14th Amendment, famous, and this has been in the news recently, right? 14th Amendment, those who engage in rebellion against the United States are not allowed to hold office or vote. So I think it's the fourth part of the amendment is where that clause is actually used, was passed in the spring of 1868. But late that year, before he left office, Andrew Johnson admitted he released a complete blanket amnesty. Anyone who had engaged in the Civil War was pardoned, but you still had to apply for that. Jefferson Davis could have been elected senator probably from any southern state, and it's my understanding, I think, that the people of Mississippi, the legislature of Mississippi, actually appointed him to go back to the U.S. Senate. He couldn't do it, in part because even under that blanket amnesty, he refused to ever ask for forgiveness because he said, I didn't do anything wrong. Mm-hmm. So there's a tension between a sense of retribution and vengeance. Somebody has to pay the price for the enormous costs in blood, 750,000 Americans dead or wounded.
And a greater number from the northern states, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and certainly the southern, the southern states laid waste, many of them, poverty everywhere. There's a sense that something needs to happen. However, at the end of the day, and we know this from our own day and age, the American people are enormously forgiving. There are many second acts in American history. You think, boy, this is the end politically for that person, and it's not so. And the same was true then. It didn't help the cause of people who wanted it to be more violent than it was, that people like Robert E. Lee were seen as, of course, the epitome of a charming Southern gentleman. He was noble, he was valorous, he fought until the very end, and then he laid his sword down. He did not advocate that people take to the hills and fight guerrilla warfare. He felt like that was dishonorable. Everything they had fought for 4 years, and whatever that was, it had been done in a way they thought. They put on uniforms and they fought as an army. They were not fighting as partisans. They were not fighting as guerrillas. They were fighting as an army, and they had been defeated. They had done their best, so let's go home and let's take whatever comes. There was simply no appetite for killing people like that. And even Davis, who remained defiant, who actually hoped that he would be charged with treason. He was hoping for that courtroom drama where he could get on the stand. He was a pretty good lawyer himself, and defend secession and defend the Confederacy against any charges of treason. None of which happened. It was unprecedented, really, in world history that something that violent, which had been, literally neighbor against neighbor, did not result in more bloodshed after it was over. Now, that is not to say there wasn't a great deal of political violence, particularly here in the South. Much of it, though, directed against the formerly enslaved when they started to exercise their political rights. That is part of the story as well. But what we're talking about, I think, are the white Confederates, soldiers and officers and government officers.
It's perfectly fine, though, and I think it's appropriate that we would prolong the conversation a little bit about the element of race, which is undeniable here. So this idea, well, let's start first of all with Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature in the second inaugural and his plan for Reconstruction, his view, and then his assassination, and Andrew Johnson taking the nation in a very different direction. I don't think anybody is going to be an enormous champion of Lincoln on the subject of race. He's an imperfect example,
Sure.
But talk about him in contrast to Andrew Johnson, if you can, on the issue of race, and then touch on, if you can, also the racial violence that we began to see almost as soon as the war was over.
Yeah. Andrew Johnson, of course, was brought on in 1864 as almost a kind of a wartime unity cabinet. He was
a compromise candidate?
Yeah, he was for vice president. He replaced Hannibal Hamlin. He was a pre-war Democrat. So he was from Tennessee, but he was a staunch unionist. He was certainly no abolitionist. He was no friend of enslaved black people. He did not believe that they were really deserving of any political or social or, quite frankly, any economic rights. He certainly understood that abolition was an outcome of the war. Everybody was going to have to accept that, white former Confederates especially. That is enshrined in the 13th Amendment, which had to be enacted and approved in the southern states as they came back into the Union. Beyond that is where he fought, of course. He wanted people to apply to him for pardon. And it seemed at first that he was really going to be this angel of retribution and vengeance, but then he sort of backed off that. As the radicals in Congress, and I use that term the way they used it then, the Republicans in Congress who were very insistent that this war had to have some meaning other than just bringing these people back in and giving them back their political power, because if we did that, as many formerly enslaved people reminded them, look, we were loyal here. Speaking as a formerly enslaved person. We were loyal. Many of us served in the United States military. You can't just give political power back to these people who are traitors.
And enslavers.
And so that's really where the war was joined. The radical Republicans sort of became staunch advocates of political rights for formerly enslaved people. Education, political rights, and voting. Now, this was a dilemma for a lot of northern states, because Pennsylvania, for instance, free black people couldn't vote. So this was not quite as cut and dried as it might seem to us now, that there's this good-bad element. There was enormous political fallout as to what this would mean. Johnson was adamant that black people didn't deserve any of that as far as he was concerned. Again, he's from Tennessee. He's a staunch unionist, but he is not an abolitionist. At no point was he an advocate. So this becomes a political tug of war. And of course, white Southerners, it's sort of war to the teeth. The idea that their formerly enslaved people were going to be holding office, voting, and not in that order, voting and holding office and receiving education, was worse, a more bitter draft than even losing the war. This was the worst. This was exactly what they would have said we went to war to prevent in the first place. The fact that they had lost the military contest in their minds did not preclude them from pushing back hard against this, and they did. There have been plenty of books written in the not so recent past, 50 years ago, books coming out now that lay out exactly the white South through violence, through political and military violence, secret societies like the Klan, unmasked and masked. We're going to do anything they could to prevent this social revolution as they saw it, and this political revolution, and they did. I mean, at the end of the day, they won that war.
Kind of like massive resistance, but 100 years earlier
Absolutely.
than the 1960s.
Yes, and with a northern public that increasingly lost its appetite for sending in federal troops or any legislation that would sort of keep that in place. And so at the end of the day, as one formerly enslaved man had, you know, we have nothing but freedom because nothing but freedom has been given to us. And essentially that's where they were left. Mm-hmm. And we know going into the Jim Crow era and beyond, and I won't just say white Southerners, white Americans did all they could legally and illegally to sort of make the 15th Amendment not work. People couldn't vote, people couldn't hold office. Education was denied. We know that Jim Crow segregation, how all of that worked. So there's a moment there in time where there's this great tension between people who see this as a time to make the United States be what it had said it always was, a place where all men are created equal. And there was an equal and violent reaction to that that ultimately won out. I would say Reconstruction didn't fail. It was defeated violently. And so when we think about what happened after the war, I think it's important to go, they didn't take former Confederates out and shoot them, but they did take formerly enslaved people and kill them if they thought they could vote. White Southerners were almost given free rein to do what they wanted. Yes, there were troops sent here. Yes, there was some enforcement of what became the Ku Klux Act. Some people were arrested and prosecuted, but the Justice Department was barely getting off the ground at that point. And so the idea of a federal civil rights law was non-existent. A civil rights division, you know, left up to the states, and we know what happened there.
Mm-hmm. You said to me in an earlier conversation that the only thing that Americans knew in the first few years after the war was over is that the war was over, who the victor was, and that we had 3 new constitutional amendments. Yeah. Slavery was over, at least in name, it was over. We defined who a citizen was, and we gave all natural-born males the right to vote.
Right.
That's it. And even determining eligibility to vote was left up to the states. So looking backward with hindsight, we see how it all unfolded. But given that there could be someone who had very aspirational opinions about what those 3 amendments meant and all that could flow out of them, there could be people who were very, very originalist about that, and that was as far as it would go. And life would go back on as it did before the war with those little exceptions.
Yeah. There are plenty of people now, historians, who look at those 3 amendments and say, if you want to talk about originalism, you start there, not in 1787, because those 3 amendments fundamentally altered the nation of federalism, the nature of what federalism was, the relationship between the states and the federal government. For the first time, the federal government is guaranteeing the rights and the voting rights. You know, voting was left up to the states in the original Constitution, and now suddenly the 15th Amendment makes voting a federal right that all males have, as you said, natural born. Now, we know almost immediately Southern states began to go to work to try to circumvent that without ever using the word you must be white in order to vote. There's a certain level of you must be educated, you're just paying a poll tax, when you go to see a registrar you're going to be asked to read certain passages, and if you can't interpret them, and you know, we know how that all turned out. The Southern
wild
states,
unevenness of application of those rules.
Or the jelly bean jar, right? You have to guess how many jelly beans. I mean, there's all kinds of ways around voting applications and the 15th Amendment without ever having to use, and the Supreme Court ruled it that way, that none of these laws violated anything because they never used the word race, they never used the word black or white. But it was clear what they were designed to do, and in fact, they were very successful. There were counties in Alabama and Mississippi that had vast black majorities, where 70% of the population had been registered to vote. By 1910, maybe 2% of the population could actually vote. I mean, we know this is why a second great Reconstruction had to happen 100 years later to sort of overturn what had been left undone, or what had been simply by sheer inertia. They just simply gave up. I think the white North decided that it wasn't worth what it was going to take to overcome white resistance.
And let's talk just for a little bit about the atmosphere in the air. So there's this virulent very often violent attitude, feeling, and action from white Southerners against their formerly enslaved black people who lived in their same region. And there's also a really strong movement to rehabilitate the reasons for the war in the first place, the lost cause, the Ladies Memorial Associations, Confederate memorials and monuments to individuals. So talk a little bit about, if you can, the environment in which we could have former Confederate leaders really acquiring celebrity status or reclaiming celebrity status during the years after the war. Right here in Savannah in the 1870s, we have a really expensive Civil War memorial.
And you can't separate, as you talk about this, it's important to remember they're going through Reconstruction while they're also trying to figure out how to come to grips with this enormous loss. Loss of life, loss of property, loss of ways of living, the breakdown of social relationships. But every dinner table in the South, there's a chair missing. On every corner in every southern city, there were legless veterans, armless veterans. Everybody could see the kind of sacrifice. So while they're going through this tumultuous period of political reconstruction, they're trying to figure out how to come to terms with loss. And so you do see, really for the first time, the idea that we are going to put up memorials. There really weren't memorials in American cities, in American society before this. There weren't many memorials to the American Revolution, for instance. I mean, we know the Washington Monument had started and then stopped. And it was not a monument, it wasn't a statue of Washington, it was something else, symbolic. But you do see at first this movement to simply memorialize the dead. So what you saw here in Savannah originally were two statues that aren't even here anymore, two figures that were angelic in nature. Well, that wasn't, by the time the statues here in Savannah, to use that as an example, was that statue was dedicated in 1879. Reconstruction isn't over by now. Everybody knows in the white South, you saw it as a tremendous failure, an experiment gone wrong that should have never happened, that was only defeated because white Southerners had risen up in their righteous might and had overthrown Reconstruction. And if they're going to memorialize, now they look at this statue and they go, or this monument, and they see two angels. And that didn't quite capture the martial spirit that by then they were after. So the movement goes from memorializing the dead to almost saying, well, let's talk about what we were doing there in the first place. We began to see a turn toward making the monuments more masculine, not using angels anymore.
Allegorical figures.
But using literal soldiers. Even if they're at parade rest, they're holding a rifle, they came to sort of symbolize every man. By the 1890s, when the Lee statue goes up in Richmond, which was this big majestic statue, no longer there, it becomes almost, now it was our cause was just, and we were led by these majestic figures like Lee, and you begin to see statues of the leaders go up everywhere. So it goes from memorializing the dead and these men who are missing arms and legs, or the three sons that you buried, to the cause itself had to be something that could justify all that suffering and death. Surely to goodness it couldn't have been slavery, because or trying to destroy the United States. That is not something that's worth putting up a monument to. So it wasn't about that anymore. It was about valor. It was about defending homeland against invaders, Yankee shopkeepers who were coming down here to destroy our way of life. The fact that there were these black people around was conveniently forgotten about. It was as if the period from the 1820s with the Missouri Compromise all the way up to 1859 with John Brown's raid just didn't happen. Never had happened. The fact that the nation had torn itself apart politically and literally in some cases over the place of slavery in a constitutional republic. As new territories came in the West, is slavery going to follow the flag or isn't it? This is what had happened for 40 or 50 years. Suddenly all that's forgotten about. In a tacit agreement between North and South, there was no push to keep Southerners from putting up monuments that glorified the Confederacy or that outright distorted what the cause had been about. Southerners in 1860 and 61 were never equivocal about what it was, right? It was a defense of slavery. They didn't feel that anything less than that would justify trying to dissolve the United States. They felt many states, many people, and even in northern states would understand that and go, well, that's right, there's a racial order there that needs to be preserved, and we get that.
And not just a racial order, but as I understand it, enslaved people represented the single biggest, most valuable category of property in the country.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, there's no, Adams County, Mississippi, where Natchez is, was the wealthiest place on earth at that time, both in terms of what they grew and the people who were owned there. So there's no doubt about it. They represented enormous capital and property. But also, that is how things should be. Alexander Stephens famously said here in a speech in Savannah that Jefferson had it wrong, that the natural condition of black people was inequality, was slavery. The idea that somehow eventually all people were going to be free had been misguided. And the Confederacy finally was going to get that right. And Stephens and everybody else thought that Europe could get behind that. They all understand where we're coming from. Of course, at that time, we all know that the pendulum of freedom was going in the other direction, right? At that time, Brazil and the United States were the only two places that still had slavery, and so the march of time, if you will, was moving in the other direction. But yes, in order to justify all that suffering, it had to be about something else, and so the lost cause began. That this was something noble, it was something all Southerners could point to with pride. Anybody who suggested it was about the preservation of slavery was lying. We can't let that get into textbooks. We can't teach our children that. You'll never see it on a monument anywhere. And of course, everybody, North and South, bought into that. And everybody understood by the turn of the century, and certainly by, let's say, 1915, by the time Birth of a Nation comes out, by then you got a whole new generation who hadn't lived through Reconstruction, they hadn't lived through all of this, who could understand that even emancipation probably had been a mistake. There's no undoing that now, but that had probably been a mistake too, that by God, these Southerners had been right all along. That this had caused more social problems in America than anything else. And so you begin to see this complicit shaking hands over the bloody chasm, if you will, and over the bodies, literally, of enslaved African Americans or formerly enslaved who found it difficult to ever secure political or even economic rights.
And I think it has to be said that women played a significant role in this reorientation of the story. The United Daughters of the Confederacy for decades and decades influenced Southern history books. My own grandmother, who was born in 1920, never said, I don't think she realized she was being political or provocative when she called the war between the states. It's just what she was taught to call it.
Yeah, exactly, as if it was an NCAA basketball tournament. And what that did also, of course, was that let people off the hook for treason, right? If you're not, people say, well, it was the Union Army. No, it was the United States Army. The United States didn't go anywhere during the Civil War, and the documents at the time refer to the United States Navy, United States Armed Forces. But if you're waging war against the states, it sounds neutral and it sounds as if it's not that entity. So the idea of having a discussion about, well, was this treason, where this conversation started, we're only beginning to come around to that again. After 160 years, we are beginning to see movements to take Confederate names off national military establishments, not just because the Confederacy was about slavery, but because had it been successful, it would have destroyed the United States as it existed in 1860, the world's only self-governing republic. So I think we're just beginning to come to grips with the nature of, was this treason? Treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. It's very specific, and in part, though, because in the colonial period, if you or I just said bad things about the king, we could be brought up on treasonous charges. The founders wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. Speech is protected, right? Actions, when speech becomes actions, then it becomes something that can be prosecuted, but speech is protected. And so what was treason? The Constitution defined waging war, trying to overthrow the government. So we're still having that discussion, right? What actions are protected? What is political theater? What is insurrection or trying to overthrow the government? They didn't know either, but we're only now, I think, beginning to see people in this country on both sides of the political aisle come to grips with the fact that the Confederacy was probably the greatest domestic threat the United States has ever faced.
I don't think that's hard to agree to, yet it is alchemy of the highest order that you or I could drive down I-16 and see on a very professional looking flagpole an American flag just above a Confederate flag.
It's as if the Confederate, and this is, over the last 10 years, Confederate iconography has come into the political discourse, and I heard someone say, the Confederate flag is not an alternate form of patriotism. Had it been successful, there wouldn't be a United States as it exists now, and the consequences for that going into the 20th century and the great wars against fascism Who knows how that would have played out? How that would have played out for black people in this country is unknown too. But there are those who say that the Confederacy, even now, that we're still getting it wrong, right? That recognizing the Confederacy as a group of patriots who fought for what they believed in is unifying, right? Representative Andrew Clyde from Georgia has recently introduced a bill in Congress wanting to put these names back on these establishments and other places because he says the Confederacy is unifying. I mean, one knows that's only true if you are willing to completely dive into the deep end of the lost cause pool, which people have been pushing back against for the last 50 years or 60 now, and completely buy into the idea that that war had nothing to do with the preservation of slavery. Make no mistake, whatever you think about the Confederacy, had the war ended after the first Battle of Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861,
with Confederate victory,
slavery would have survived intact, and no one can say when or if it ever would have ended. You haven't asked me this, but the idea we know how Southerners resisted civil rights. To believe that white Southerners would have ever voluntarily given up slavery, knowing what we know about subsequent American history, I find it hard to believe. Yeah. I'm not suggesting it would still be around in 2024, but it's not hard. It's not hard to believe that some vestige of it certainly would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, one could argue that there are still vestiges.
Boy, if that doesn't get us in trouble, nothing will.
Of economic disadvantage, of wealth gap, of education gap, incarceration, and
well,
so on.
And we know, right, that going back to we said in the 1890s, there's all these efforts to suppress the black vote, and it just seems like every time we've seen throughout American history, there's efforts after every election to reform the voting process or secure the integrity of elections. And black people, with good reason in our history, point to that and go, this is an effort to suppress the black vote. They've always used that kind of language. And so whether it's true or not, I think there's certainly reasons for people to believe what they believe because there's a long history of that in this country, going back to this period we're talking about.
If we try to go back to the closing decades of the 19th century, when many of these people were still alive, I'm going to tease some of the topics that are coming up here, and I know that you won't steal complete thunder of the others.
Oh, I might.
It's fine. We'll give people an appetizer. So, among the Confederates, former Confederates who underwent what I think you'd call a bit more rehabilitation than others, there's General Longstreet.
Yeah.
Tell about him. We're gonna.
Oh, God, he's most fascinating. You're going to have Elizabeth Varyn come down and talk. Are you really?
No. We have a different speaker about him.
I mean, Longstreet, of course, his great sin. He had been Lee's right arm, but he, of course, didn't want to take. He didn't want to be blamed for the loss at Gettysburg, and he had the temerity to sort of push back against that after the war and blame Lee. And if that wasn't bad enough, he became a Republican, and he was written off as a traitor. I mean,
to the Confederacy.
To the Confederacy, sure, and to the white South. I mean, he had been born here in Georgia. I think he was actually born in South Carolina, but he grew up here in Georgia. But he lived long enough, though, that grudgingly white Southerners began to sort of accept him, even though they never forgave him because he never gave up the Republican Party. But he lived, I think, until 1903. He lived another 40 years after the war was over, and lived long enough to push back against people. He constantly was carrying on these sort of paper wars, a war of words over his role at Gettysburg. Whose fault was it? But he had the temerity to criticize General Lee, and you just didn't do that.
Right. And let's talk about Lee a little bit. Of course, he's among the elder statesmen when the war is over, so he has only a few more years to live, but becomes the president of Washington College. And
he does. He goes home, worried, kind of looking over his shoulder, not sure what the U.S. government is going to do to him. Grant was adamant that Lee should not be prosecuted because he had given him his word, and he really impressed that upon Johnson. You can't do that, and he didn't. He was, and Lee actually applied for a pardon. His pardon was lost. We don't know what happened to it, but we do know that he was pardoned in, I think, 1978 by Jimmy Carter, posthumously, of course. But he never held office again. He didn't want to hold office. He, from everything I understand about Lee, publicly he said and tried to do the right thing. He became president of this little college, Washington College. Didn't particularly like it, but was an able administrator. He had been superintendent at West Point before the war, so he had a little experience at that. Privately, it's a different story. I think he was pretty bitter. He resented the 15th Amendment. He resented the idea that the black people were going to be given any place in political life in the South. He thought that was a mistake. But he was, of course, revered because he was seen as the symbol of reconciliation. He was the great warrior who laid down his sword, told everybody else to do the same. You know, we did our best, we did it honorably, now let's go home. Let's not sully this by trying to continue a guerrilla war, or like Davis, you know, trying to run to, you know, Davis went to Canada after the war. He traveled to Europe. It took him a long time to come back and feel like he was part of the United States again. Wrote his book in 1880. Lee resisted any attempts to do that. He resisted attempts to make money. People came to him and said, endorse these cigars, endorse these shoes or these shirts, and we'll pay you a tremendous amount of money. That's held up as, again, how he's different than Grant. Grant seemingly would sell his name for anything.
And he became president and struggled financially, as I understand it, during his...
He sure did. He sure did. Lee struggled financially but wouldn't sell out, supposedly. And so, now it's interesting, he was seen as this old man. He died at 63, which, of course, these days is not old at all. But he had health problems, and because he died early in the process, by 1869, he's sort of seen as the saint. Statues of him go up. He becomes almost untouchable, but he becomes one of these Americans that everybody, whether you live in Hoboken, New Jersey or Louisiana, can take pride in. He's an American, he's one of our great military heroes, and he follows in the great legacy of Washington, whether any of that's true or not. Now, Ken Burns has said Robert E. Lee was responsible for the deaths of more American soldiers than anybody except Adolf Hitler, which is a statement of fact. And so you have to reconcile. And Lee, I would say, has been the hardest in this whole thing. Maybe not for some people, but taking his statue down, this idea that he's a gentleman somehow. He held the same views of blacks as almost everybody else in Virginia at that time. And so, you know, the idea that somehow he's different or is given a pass, had he been successful at what he was trying to do, there wouldn't be a United States.
Right. And I've been reading a good bit about this recently, and it seems like during his tenure as president of Washington College, he was incubating a little laboratory of the lost cause right there on campus. And so trying to...
Sometimes quietly and sometimes not, but yeah. And supposedly Lee came out against things like statues and monuments because he said those would be manipulated for wrong causes, which of course they were. You know, wrong if you think the Confederacy didn't have anything to do with race, right?
Right, and intimidating later generations of black people who had to walk under the statue of Lee or whoever to get to the county courthouse to conduct their business.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a book that I came across that's 10 years old. You knew about it, William Blair's book called With Malice Towards Some. And there's an interesting quotation here in a review. Ironically, this says, the lenient approach allowed Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders to become heroic figures to later generations of Americans of all sections, North and South, said Blair, citing words written by Union General George Thomas in 1868. Think how early that is. And this is a crystal ball moment, I think, for this General Thomas. And he writes, quote, the crime of treason might be covered with a counterfeit varnish of patriotism so that the precipitators of the rebellion might go down in history hand in hand with the defenders of the U.S. government. So we put U.S. Grant on the same level as Robert E. Lee and vice versa?
Oh, and let's be honest here. Look, for most of those years, since 1865, Lee towers over Grant, right? Grant won as the butcher. He had all these men he could just throw frontal assaults and meat grinder. He was the butcher's bill was always... Lee was a gentleman warrior, right? He's a cavalier. He was the tactician. The only reason Grant won is because he just had superior resources. You know, for years that was the prevailing interpretation. Absolutely. I don't think it is anymore. I think people understand Grant was a great... But Thomas is a very interesting character. You know, he was Virginian. He was the exception to the rule, right? The idea that Lee did, you know, was what he was born to do. And Thomas said, look, I took an oath on West Point. I took an oath every time I got promoted in the U.S. Army to maintain and preserve the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And he maintained that. Ironically, he was called a traitor by all the people of Virginia. He was very bitter after the war that people like him who had maintained his oath, who had done what he was supposed to do as he saw it, were derided as traitors, and people like Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all these people were going to be elevated to the, as he says, defenders of the. It made him so angry, like he had a stroke. I mean, he died at like 58 years old because he just, he almost had Archie Bunker-esque fits of just rage over what you just said. The idea that these people that he saw as just traitors had resigned their commissions from the army to go fight for the other side. And he said, if that's not treason, I don't know what is. It's right there in the Constitution.
And his story, his decision, really belie this idea that Lee could do no other.
Absolutely.
General Thomas did other.
Well, everybody said, Thomas was married to a Northerner, so it was easier for him. Here was Lee married to, George Washington's granddaughter. It wasn't so easy. Even the people in Lee's own family, one of his cousins, Samuel Lee, was an officer in the Navy, and he remained loyal to the United States. And he said, Robert should have spent less time reading his Bible and more time reading his commission. So the idea, this is the other thing, the idea that these people didn't have a choice. Well, Robert E. Lee had a choice, and he made his choice. And he understood, I think they all understood on some level, that if this didn't go the way they wanted it to, they all could wind up swinging from the end of a rope. That it didn't happen. Historians like Jackie Jones have said was just the magnanimity of a great nation. Because again, unprecedented. And the ironic thing is, white Southerners for the next 100 years cried about how horrible Reconstruction was and how they were the most put upon people in the world, that this thing had been done to them. And as Jackie Jones pointed out, some of them lost the right to vote for a couple of years, and that was it. That never had people who had committed rebellion on the scale they had been allowed to just go off scot-free.
Let alone their leaders' names being put on
military establishments.
Yeah.
For future generations, and carved into mountains and statues everywhere. Yeah. It is unprecedented. They're the only combatant enemy of the United States that's ever been allowed to memorialize their dead on the United States soil. We don't have, I've searched in vain in Savannah for the North Vietnamese monument here, and they don't have one. There's not one to Japanese soldiers. There's not one to the Germans. I'm not saying there aren't monuments somewhere to German soldiers, but the idea that you're celebrating the valor of the SS or the Germans, who fought as fanatically as anybody ever did, but we don't separate the cause for which they were fighting from the valor of the soldier. We're willing to give that pass, I think, to the Confederacy, or have been, at least to this point.
So it seems. So there are a couple of figures, and we can wind up here. There are a couple of figures we're not exploring in our series. Custer is one.
Yeah.
Nathan Bedford Forrest is another one. And are there any other people that you want to draw our attention to in their we all know what happened to Custer. He continued his military career, obviously, in the Indian Wars, but it didn't go so well for him out west.
Right. No, it did not. And Nathan Bedford Forrest is very interesting. He does not come from the same class as Robert E. Lee. Literally, he was not seen as this gentleman. He was kind of seen, for lack of a... In today's parlance, we would probably call him he was kind of a redneck, right? He came from that class. He did not conduct himself in the way that he was uneducated to a point. But
he made a millionaire out of himself.
He did make a millionaire out of himself, and he was, by all accounts, a brilliant tactician and a great cavalry commander and a great leader. And so I think he was in the cavalry, wasn't he? I don't want to...
I think you're right.
I've destroyed my credibility in a matter of seconds here. But he's one of those problematic figures. In Memphis, which is, of course, divided by race now and has been for a long time, his statues there are highly controversial. His grave and where it is. And, Shelby Foote was one of the people that he defended, not just as a great military leader, but didn't want to see anything happen to his statues there, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, because for him, this is what the reconciliation was. It was a handshake guaranteeing white Southerners could worship the Confederacy unmolested. I've heard him say that out loud. The idea that you're not going to come after these people and malign them and call them traitors and tell us we have to take their statues down. That's not part of the deal. And of course, the deal never should have happened. It was done at the expense of all kinds of things. The truth, for one, as to what the war was about, what its consequences were, how Reconstruction played out. So, some of these figures, interestingly, the really interesting people to me are people in the Confederacy, and there's one person in particular whose name I'm drawing a blank on right now, but he was quite open about what the Confederacy has been about. He kind of pushed back against the lost cause, and I shouldn't keep talking about it if I can't remember his name, but he was involved in that controversy over the lost cause and the different schools of thought that, we all knew what it was about in 1861. We all understood what was happening, and anybody who tries to, change that narrative now is a liar. And so I think those people at least take them for whatever, the people who were at least open about that. But there's no doubt that most Confederates had a second life. I mean, Alexander Stephens, right, died as governor of Georgia. There's no sense these people need to go off into exile or live on the island of Patmos or write their memoirs, at Elba or whatever. American history is nothing if not all about second acts, second life. Richard Nixon, right?
Resuscitation.
1962 loses the race for governor of California, and everybody thought he was dead. 6 years later, he's president. Wins a landslide second term. We're living in that right now. I mean, everybody watching TV on January 6th would have thought that, President Trump's political future was nil, and it absolutely is not. So I think that the context of the times in which we're living have a long history in our country. Go back to the Revolution. Most loyalists who chose to stay in the United States after the war was over and emotions began to subside, they were sort of accepted as part of the American fabric. There's always been this sense, I think, that the American people, if you go about your business and do and leave each, you live and let live, or even if you don't live and let live.
Mm-hmm. There is this kind of weird "I'm okay, you're okay" mentality.
There is, and
about
particularly where race is concerned. And there's no pulling out that racial thread from the Civil War and the Confederacy and post-war. It's why it's still so controversial. That's why there's still this idea that it's controversial to teach about slavery in American schools, but not to teach about the Confederacy. If that doesn't have something to do with race, then I'll sit here while you explain to me what it does have to do about. I mean, it has been the third rail of American history for a long time, and I think it is. But there are people that you can separate out the idea of them having a second political life. Americans just have very short memories.
Yeah, these rules around what states will allow to be taught in classrooms and not. That's one huge reason that I today am utterly unfit to be a K through 12 teacher. I'm going to stick with the students I have at the Learning Center.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Where we don't have to observe such things. We just had an observance last week of Juneteenth, and someone pointed out that the nuts and bolts of what that holiday even means is illegal to teach in 15 states.
Yeah.
Yet it's a federal holiday.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So I wait to see what the watering down is going to look like. Somehow everybody's a hero, everybody gets a trophy, even when there are clear heroes and villains in every story.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
It really makes, Well, Stan, I do wish that you could be with us in person as this series gets started, but I am so grateful that even though your in-person appearance on the first day of our series was impossible, that you were willing to pre-record some really interesting, provocative comments for us to consider.
Well, I love doing things with you and talking about this kind of stuff, and I could go on for another hour, but I won't. Thank you.
Makes me very, very happy. I appreciate it very much, Stan.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all as well for joining us today for this inaugural program. I hope that we'll see you frequently across the next 5 weeks as we bring one figure after another to life in our After the War series.